Welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, the euro. Is it the main problem with Europe? And if we didn't have it, would the EU be a better place to live? And perhaps, would we still want to be part of it? This week we ask, is the euro to blame for European disunity? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Well, the euro is 20 years old this year. It was launched by the Maastricht Treaty, of course, and Jean-Claude Juncker kicked this year off with a tweet saying how the euro has delivered prosperity and protection to our citizens. It's become a symbol of unity and sovereignty and stability, which all sounds pretty good, but I think he might be the only person on the planet who believes all this. But Steve, if the euro didn't exist, would we have Brexit, do you think?
No, I don't think we would have Brexit, because a major factor behind why people voted for Brexit was the impact of people coming to the UK under the free movement, because the economies they lived in were tanking. The worst example, of course, was Greece. So there aren't that many Greeks to make the move. So what people would have found more often would be some Spanish. I certainly found quite a few Spanish waiters working around town. All very good if people are moving because there's vacancies in positions and they enjoy the weather in England better than they enjoy it in Spain. Of course, anybody who did that would need their head read. So what is actually moving is the push factor, which Wynne Godley identified brilliantly in 1992, just after the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, which Jean-Claude Juncker said it was the most important signature he ever made. And I suppose in the same sense as signing your own death warrant, that is a pretty important signature. He said that if a region has no capacity to fiscally stimulate and has no recompense for effectively a trade deficit, the only options facing are terminal decline with migration, emigration, or death. The only way out. And in
Greece, of course, we're seeing that net emigration. There's more people. I mean, we were seeing quite a big reduction in the population of Greece. But it's all relatively recent, isn't it? Because until 2008, things weren't doing too badly. We were seeing growth right up to 2008. It was really the global financial crisis that changed things. And that seems irreversible. So why? Because until then, it looked fine, didn't it?
I suppose the basic analogy I can give is a bit like saying a boat with huge holes in the hull works fine so long as it's going fast enough for the hydrofoils to work and take you above the waterline. As soon as the global financial crisis hit, bang, you hit waterline and start sinking. And it's not so much sinking, it's the captain deciding the best way to manage the boat is to hit more holes in the side so it takes in more water. It is just an insanely badly managed, badly designed monetary system. And if you take a look at the data, and of course that's one of my fixations, what has actually happened has been the euro appeared to be working between 2000 and 2008, because across that period of time, the countries that were running trade deficits within the euro, and of course that involves Greece and Spain and Italy to some extent, certainly France as well, they were compensated by enormous borrowing, mainly from French and German banks. The whole free movement of capital thing meant that the lack of stimulus from the government side by the enforcement of the 3% maximum government deficit rule, the lack of that was made up for by a gigantic increase in the level of private debt. And it's just well in every last country where the euro is in operation, right, and the country's running a trade deficit.
So why can we blame the euro for that, though? Because we see private debt racking up in lots of other countries, like, of course, Australia.
Oh, yeah, we do. And the thing is, what that meant was that while, and this is a global phenomenon, this is what they call the Great Moderation, was actually a debt-driven, a credit-driven boom in the global economy. So it's not just the euro that experienced that. It was, as you say, it was pretty much a global phenomenon. The thing is, it all worked fine until you hit the crisis. Now, when the crisis hits, to give an idea of the scale of the stimulus that America went through, the level of spending in what you might call the Obama stimulus was equivalent to 4 to 3 times the size of the New Deal. We all know how important the New Deal was to America. Yeah, but there are some Austrians who challenged that. But that enormous stimulus from the government spending made up for the fact that the private sector was massively deleveraging in countries like America. So you went from credit demand being 15% of GDP before the crisis to -5 after, but then it very rapidly recovered to back up by 2010. It was positive again, and you had stimulus from the private sector spending as well as stimulus from the government sector spending. But that wasn't possible in the countries that were tied to the euro. So to give you a comparison, Spain was by far the most extreme example of this. Just to give you start with America's data first of all. In America, the level of private debt, which is the change in private debt, which is what creates credit, that reached 15% of GDP. And it fell to -5 in the aftermath, and now it's running about +7.
So 15 up to the global financial crisis, and then -5 after.
Yeah,
right.
Because Spain, on the other hand, went from about 80% of GDP in roughly the start of the euro to 220% of GDP by the time the crisis hit. Credit demand hit 35%, almost 40% of GDP, and fell to -10 and has not recovered. It temporarily hit positive for a short while in 2015 or 16, but it's been negative all the way through. So what you've had, courtesy of the imposition of the austerity policy, is not just a lack of government stimulus. It's also being a private sector that's continuing to delever, and therefore you have two things sucking demand out of the economy. The only way you can compensate is for GDP to continue falling.
So how much of that, though, is the fault of the idea of the euro, and how much of it is just the way that it's been implemented? How much of it, in other words, is this idea of, well, we must have austerity to get ourselves out of a crisis rather than growing out of a crisis?
Well, it isn't just austerity as part of the crisis. The whole focus of the euro was the belief in responsible government spending, as it's defining responsible, meaning keeping government debt low, as if that had been proven to be the cause of all previous financial crises, when quite the opposite is the case. Work by my colleague Richard Vague has shown that every last crisis that's occurred in the last 1.5 centuries, in about 150 of them around the globe, have always been private debt crises, not government debt crises. Right. But the obsession about low government debt is a German thing, particularly. Swallowed by a lot of neoliberal economists as well, and neoliberal politicians who parrot what their economists tell them. So that combined with the 3% maximum deficit target was that was built into the design of the euro. Now, if at the same time the euro had involved transfers between countries running internal trade deficits, then it would have been nowhere near as extreme. But of course, it didn't involve that. So if you were running if you had a trade deficit with Germany, and most of Europe has a trade deficit with Germany, and you also had higher inflation than Germany, and no, we're not talking massively larger inflation. Italy's inflation rate is a whole 3% over the. Actually, closer to 2%, which is the target set in the treaties that formed the euro, a 2% inflation rate. Germany's hit 1%. Well, over 20 years, that gives you more than a 20% cost advantage for German goods versus Italian goods. So all these things could have been fixed up if there was an internal transfer mechanism, as in taxes paid in Germany would be distributed to spending in Greece and Spain. That happens in America, but not in Europe.
And there is so much more of this discussion on Europe and the euro. If you want to hear it in full, then you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. Choose one of the subscription plans in the right-hand side of the front webpage there. Or you can become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. If you pledge to support him to the tune of $10 or more per month to help him with his research and his work, then you get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series as part of that subscription. So you can do that at patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. Hopefully you'll do one of those two things, and we'll see you back here again very soon. Thanks for listening.